On October 26th of the year 2000, the Sony PlayStation 2 made its debut in retail stores across North America. It was highly anticipated. The original PlayStation was a smash hit, surprising Nintendo and basically driving Sega back to the drawing board. Revivals of old franchises, debuts of new franchises, reaching out to more than just your typical gaming fan, the PlayStation was a big hit for Sony, so a follow up was certainly expected. What we did not expect was how popular the PlayStation 2 would be. On this episode of RePete, we are celebrating 20 years of the PlayStation 2 as we look back at the PlayStation 2 launch back in 2000. For me, I didn't get the PlayStation 2 at launch. No, I was still using my Dreamcast pretty regularly. I had sunk thousands of dollars into the Dreamcast and its games, and I was convinced that the Dreamcast was going to weather the storm and was going to do okay, much like the Genesis did. I have no reason to think otherwise. I was happy with my original PlayStation. I was still using my Nintendo 64 as well. I was kind of buried in games at the time and just didn't feel the need to upgrade right then. Not to mention watching on TV as there were lines of people waiting for their PlayStation 2s and hearing the stories from malls about people having to be escorted to their cars because their PlayStation 2s were being stolen. I was ready to just kind of sit on the sidelines and wait and see what happens. That is until January of 2001. I've talked about this in previous videos, but in January in 2001, it was leaked that Sega was going to be discontinuing the Dreamcast, leaving hardware altogether, and going into software publishing only. It was a rash decision on my part, but I took all of my Dreamcast stuff, my system, all of my VMUs, my controllers, all of my games. I brought them to a video game store called Fantasy Realms in West Springfield. I was very friendly with the owner. His name is Guy. I brought all the stuff in. I plopped it on the counter. And I lucked out because there was one PlayStation 2 console brand new still left. And those were really hard to come by even in January of 2001. I said, I am getting that. And I traded my stuff in. And not only did I have enough to get the console, but I had enough to get some games as well. And I'll talk about a few of those as we move forward. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to be going over some of the launch titles for the PlayStation 2. These came out at or just after the system's launch. Some of these I bought at launch, others I wound up playing later. All of these I have some kind of personal attachment to, hence the reason that I want to bring them up in this 20th anniversary episode. So let's talk first about Dynasty Warriors 2. I had never played the original Dynasty Warriors, if I'm being completely honest. It was an original PlayStation game, I know that. It was kind of like a fighting game, I know that, but that's all I knew. But I heard about this from Guy and his friend Ron while they were at E3 in 2000. The three of us were hosting a talk show about video games on a local radio station. They were at E3, I was at the studio, and I was interviewing them, and I asked them what game or games they saw that really impressed them, and this was one that they could not stop talking about because of the number of soldiers that were on screen at once and how fast-paced it was and just how arcadey it felt. And you know, even after they talked about it, I didn't get this right away. It wasn't until Dynasty Warriors 3 that I got involved in Dynasty Warriors, and I've been a fan of this series ever since. It is impressive, though, when you look at this being a launch title, just how impressively it does run, and just how many characters, how many soldiers are on screen at once. It does slow down from time to time, but I think it's a very impressive technical performer. And oh, by the way, the soundtrack is excellent. If you have Apple Music, you can download all of the Dynasty Warriors soundtracks, including the best one, which is Dynasty Warriors 3. But again, Dynasty Warriors 2, a PlayStation 2 launch title, and really the debut of the Dynasty Warriors revamped series as we know it today. I should get into my retro referee shirt for this one, but I'm not going to do that because that is not what this episode is about. But this is a sports game. We do have a couple of sports games in the mix here. And this is a game from Konami. This is a game in a series that I have enjoyed since its arcade roots back in the 1980s. I'm talking about ESPN International Track and Field. This is a game that I opened up for Unsealed some time ago. Konami entered into a licensing agreement with ESPN to use their branding and presentation style while also adapting it to its own arcade or sports games. I enjoy this game a lot. While I enjoy the button mashing events in this game a bit more, because that's my specialty, there are different kinds of events in the game that make it certainly interesting. And when we look at the back of the case here, I think that the screenshots look pretty darn good for an early PlayStation 2 title. As with a lot of PlayStation 2 games, one of the more impressive things about this is that the animation is a lot smoother than it would have been on the original PlayStation. No more are we looking at 20 to 30 frames per second, but more closer to 60 frames per second in a lot of these games, so they were a lot smoother and a lot of fun to play, I think. I still have a soft spot for the original Track and Field, of course, and I do play International Track and Field for my PlayStation every now and again, but this game is probably the best of the lot if we're talking in terms of technical performance. Next on the list is a game that I bought because Namco, and I'm a big fan of Namco, but I was not ready for how simulation aspected this is. This is MotoGP. It is motorcycle racing instead of car racing, and it is certainly not arcadey, although there is an arcade mode in it. There is a learning curve here, and if you're not ready to scale that learning curve, you will be humbled awfully quickly. But again, the game looks good, it sounds good. Technically speaking, it performs pretty well, and I did not know at the time that this was a launch title. I actually got this sometime later. But yeah, I think that this handles pretty well. But again, it's more for simulation aspected racing fans and for motorcycle racers as well. It's another sports game. Don't leave. Don't leave. Because this sports game I think is pretty good. It is the debut of the NHL series for the PlayStation. This is PlayStation 2. This is NHL 2001. And like so many other games that made the jump from PlayStation to PS2, the game performs much better in a technical sense. You can see here the detail on the player faces. There are also more in the way of stat overlays. The presentation's been revamped. We now have Bill Clement in the studio along with Jim Hewson, so they call the action pretty well. There are also some really cool gameplay or replay angles, I should say, that are almost like the Matrix. It uses that bullet time where when the puck comes off the stick, you get the camera kind of whipping around in a circle. And it just, back then it looked a lot cooler. Now I still think it looks pretty cool, although there's some people that are just done with that whole thing. I also opened this for Unsealed some time ago as well, or else I would have gotten it to open for the 20th anniversary here. Next on the list is my favorite of the PlayStation 2 launch titles. It is the fifth game in a series that I have played all of the games for. It is the series that drove me to buy an original PlayStation back in 1995. You've probably heard of it. It's called Ridge Racer, and this is Ridge Racer 5. Ridge Racer 5 is totally stylish, has some great music, although not quite as house-oriented as we saw in earlier Ridge Racer games. But the graphics here are just unbelievably good, especially when driving by yourself. Split screen suffers a little bit in terms of how it performs, but when you're playing on your own, the light sourcing, the detail, the animation, it's all there. It plays just like an arcade game. In fact, there was a Ridge Racer 5 arcade game. But this is a game that no PlayStation 2 owner should be without. And I may sound a bit biased because I'm such a Ridge Racer fan, but between this and Burnout 3 Takedown, those are the only two arcade racing games that you need. And they're both on the PS2, so get them if you don't have them already. Speaking of arcade games, the next title I want to talk about is Silent Scope, also from Konami. Silent Scope, at first you think wouldn't work because the arcade cabinet comes with a sniper rifle attachment with a scope on top, and this doesn't have that. So you have to use the analog stick to move the reticle around in order to get the shot that you need. For some players this doesn't work well, but for me when I play it, I think it works just fine. And again, as someone who grew up in arcades and spent a lot of time in arcades, when you don't have to keep popping tokens in and when the game is fairly close to the arcade original, I'm okay with that. There are some issues in terms of the fact that it is an M-rated game, of course, because there is gunfire going on, but there isn't blood really, at least a lot of it, and it's not as violent as some other games we would see in later years. The successive Silent Scope games, 2 and 3, I think perform a little bit better. Silent Scope 2 is my favorite of the lot, but nevertheless, you can find this for fairly cheap, and I think that it's a lot of fun. It's also available for the Dreamcast, and there's a really good Game Boy Advance version of this as well, believe it or not. Next on the list, we have SSX, perhaps the most popular of the PlayStation 2 launch titles, and also the debut of the EA Sports big brand. Of course, in 2000, extreme sports were at a fever pitch in terms of popularity thanks to the Tony Hawk games. EA ran with it with SSX by taking it away from the skate parks and onto the slopes with snowboarding. The game is stylish. The game has an amazing soundtrack. It is very colorful. It performs well. And probably more important is, unlike the other games I've talked about, this is completely original for the PS2. And it shows. It was the game that really put the PlayStation 2 on the map and made people pay attention. It was not just another sequel. It was its own thing. And that was what was really impressive. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any SSX games in a while, but the PlayStation 2 does have its fair share of them, and I think that they all do run very, very well. Next on the list is Street Fighter EX3. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is not a Street Fighter game, really. It's an offshoot. Now, hang on. Capcom did publish this. Capcom did allow the characters to be licensed. And if we're being completely honest, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha is a lot better than people give it credit for, at least in my opinion. It's a lot of fun to play. It brought the series into 3D for the first time, where it hadn't been yet, and still really hasn't been that much. And it runs well. Also, the music is amazing. If you've played any of the EX games, don't forget that Fighting Layer EX is available for the PlayStation 4 and I believe for PC, and is also quite good. Has some of the characters that aren't Street Fighter characters from this series. I do think it looks pretty decent, although because it is an early PlayStation 2 title, there are some issues with slowdown here and there. But nevertheless, this one always holds a special place in my heart because, again, Street Fighter. It's not Street Fighter Alpha 3, of course, which is my favorite game in the series altogether, but nevertheless, I do have fun revisiting this from time to time. And last on the list is Tekken Tag Tournament, the game that still runs and looks as awesome today as it did back in 2000. I had not played the arcade original, but when I saw this running in a store, I knew it was a game that I had to own. Again, just like the game, and I know that I keep repeating the same things, but going from the 30 frames per second that we saw on the PlayStation to silky smooth 60 frames per second here, and although the Tekken games for the PlayStation also ran at 60 frames, they were not as detailed as this. The games ran and looked just almost like they did in their cinema scenes. Maybe not quite as clean, but nevertheless, the amount of detail and the amount of lighting was great. And oh, by the way, this has the best Tekken extra ever. This has Tekken Bowl in it, and I know they brought Tekken Bowl back for Tekken 7, but this was the originator, and I have spent so many hours playing that. It is an absolute blast. The PlayStation 2 console is one of the best selling consoles of all time, and with good reason. DVD functionality brought on more than just game players. It was a great thing to have in a bedroom or in the living room. It was a way to watch movies or play games. It eventually also became a way that we could get online. We could also play our original PlayStation games inside there as well. The PlayStation 2 stuck around for a long time before the PlayStation 3 came on board, and even then, because the PlayStation 3 struggled out of the gate, people were still using their PS2 consoles for a long time thereafter. It is one of my favorite consoles of all time. I love the PlayStation a lot, as you can tell by my sweater here, but the PS2 just supersedes it in every way. It plays original PlayStation games. The PS2 games cover so many different genres and perform so well. There were so many different features in all of the discs because there were DVD-ROM media. You could go behind the scenes, or you could check out artwork or other really cool things. And personally speaking, the PlayStation 2 was just important in my life. The PlayStation 2 helped me to get through some difficult times. PlayStation 2 was the console that helped me get on the map for writing video game reviews. I still remember playing Metal Gear Solid 2 for 2 days straight with very little sleep to be able to make my review deadline. Um, so I'm always going to have fond memories of the system. There's a reason that I have 950 games for it. It's just great. And although maybe some of the games have aged a little bit and some of the games haven't stood up to the test of time, those of us who were around in 2000 and 2001 and through the first decade of the 2000s will fondly remember that system as one of Sony's crowning achievements. Thanks for watching this episode of RePete. I really appreciate it. Take care of yourselves and each other. Don't forget that we'll have a special episode of Unsealed featuring the Retro Referee with opening some brand new sealed launch titles for the PlayStation 2. Until then, take care.